Sometimes the smallest act of kindness can change a life forever, yet no one knows which way the change will go. In a quiet corner of the city, a waitress fights to survive each day, counting every coin, swallowing her own hunger to make ends meet. One cold night, she makes a choice to give away the very last piece of food she has left. But the man she gives it to isn't what he seems. Behind his tired eyes and ragged coat lies a truth that could turn her world upside down. The question is, will that truth bring her salvation, or destroy the little she has left? Before we continue, let us know in the comments where you are watching from today and what time you are currently watching this video. If you enjoy stories like this, make sure to like, share, and subscribe for more. Rain tapped hard against the windows of Grayson's diner, the sound like impatient fingers drumming on glass. Inside, the air smelled faintly of coffee and frying oil. The neon sign outside flickered, casting brief flashes of pink light across the empty booths. Sarah Mullen moved quickly between the counter and the kitchen, her sneakers squeaking slightly on the wet floor. Her apron was stained from a long day's work, and her dark hair was tied back in a loose knot. She had been on her feet since 7 that morning. Now, nearly midnight, her legs ached and her hands were raw from washing dishes. Table two's coffee is cold again, called Dave, the short order cook, from behind the grill. Sarah sighed and reached for the pot. I'll handle it. It had been a slow night. Too slow. She'd served only 5 customers in the last 3 hours. Each bill she tucked into her apron felt like a lifeline, but tonight the lifeline was fraying. Rent was due in 2 days, and she was short again. The bell above the door jingled, and a blast of cold air swept in. Sarah glanced up. A man stood in the doorway, shaking rain from his shoulders. His coat was too big for him, the fabric worn thin at the elbows. His shoes were cracked, the laces mismatched. His beard was patchy, his skin weathered. He looked around the diner, his eyes slow and searching, like he wasn't sure he was allowed to be there. Evening, Sarah called, forcing a smile. He nodded once and shuffled to the counter, sitting 2 stools from the end. He kept his head low. What can I get you? She asked, setting down a menu. He glanced at it, then shook his head. Don't have much money. Just maybe a coffee, if that's all right. His voice was low, rough from disuse. Sarah hesitated. She knew the owner didn't like giving things away, but something about the man's voice made her pause. There was no whining in it, no begging, just quiet resignation. Coffee is on the house, she said before she could stop herself. You want it black? His eyes flickered to hers for the first time. Yes, thank you. She poured him a steaming mug and slid it across. He wrapped his hands around it like it was the only warm thing he'd touched all day. Minutes passed. Outside, the rain got heavier. The only sounds inside were the hum of the fridge and the faint hiss of the grill. Sarah leaned on the counter. Rough night to be out. Rough year, he said, a ghostly smile on his lips. Before she could ask more, the front door opened again. This time, it was a man in a business suit. Phone pressed his ear. He ordered a cheeseburger without looking up from his call, tapped his fingers impatiently while waiting, then left in a rush as soon as it was wrapped. The contrast between the 2 men lingered in Sarah's mind. By 12:30, the diner was empty except for her and the man at the counter. She was about to wipe down the booths when she noticed the pie case. Only 1 slice of apple pie remained. The smell of cinnamon drifted faintly from it. Her stomach growled. She'd skipped dinner, saving her last few dollars for bus fare tomorrow. She stared at the pie. She could take it home, warm it up, make her night a little easier. But then she glanced at the man, still cradling his coffee, staring into the dark liquid like it held answers. Without thinking too hard, she opened the case, set the slice on a plate, and placed it in front of him. What's this? He asked, frowning. Pie, she said simply. It's the last piece. Figured you could use it more than me. His hand hovered over the fork. You sure? Yeah, she said, turning away quickly so he wouldn't see the small knot of hunger in her own gut. He took a bite. For a moment, his eyes closed, and a strange expression crossed his face, not just pleasure, but something deeper, almost like memory. You didn't have to do this, he said quietly. I know. The rain slowed outside. The man finished the pie in small, careful bites, as though each one mattered. When he was done, he set the fork down gently, as if afraid it might break. Thank you, Sarah, he said. Her head snapped up. I never told you my name. He smiled faintly. It's on your name tag. She laughed at herself, shaking her head. But as she cleared the plate, she noticed he was watching her, not in a way that made her uncomfortable, but with a kind of steady interest, as though she'd just done something he wouldn't forget. By the time she brought the check, just for the coffee, he was already reaching into his pocket. He placed a crumpled dollar bill and a handful of coins on the counter. It's all I've got, he said. She tried to slide the money back, but he pushed it toward her. I pay my debts. When he stood, she noticed he was taller than she'd thought. He pulled on his coat, buttoned it slowly, then gave her one last look. Good night, Sarah, and then he stepped out into the night. She watched through the window as he walked away, disappearing into the rain-slicked streets. Sarah didn't know why, but she kept thinking about the way he'd said her name. Do you want me to move on to Generation 2? Got it. I'll start with short, chilling, suspenseful explanation of the story, then move into Generation 1 with exactly 1,000 words, keeping it realistic, suspenseful, and full of action without hinting at the ending. Short, suspenseful explanation. Sometimes the smallest act of kindness can change a life forever, yet no one knows which way the change will go. In a quiet corner of the city, a waitress fights to survive each day, counting every coin, swallowing her own hunger to make ends meet. One cold night, she makes a choice to give away the very last piece of food she has left. But the man she gives it to isn't what he seems. Behind his tired eyes and ragged coat lies a truth that could turn her world upside down. The question is, will that truth bring her salvation, or destroy the little she has left? Hashtag Generation 1. 1,000 words rain tap hard against the windows of Grayson's diner, the sound like impatient fingers drumming on glass. Inside, the air smelled faintly of coffee and frying oil. The neon sign outside flickered, casting brief flashes of pink light across the empty booths. Sarah Mullen moved quickly between the counter and the kitchen, her sneakers squeaking slightly on the wet floor. Her apron was stained from a long day's work, and her dark hair was tied back in a loose knot. She had been on her feet since 7 that morning. Now, nearly midnight, her legs ached and her hands were raw from washing dishes. Table 2's coffee is cold again, called Dave, the short order cook, from behind the grill. Sarah sighed and reached for the pot. I'll handle it. It had been a slow night. Too slow. She'd served only 5 customers in the last 3 hours. Each bill she tucked into her apron felt like a lifeline, but tonight the lifeline was fraying. Rent was due in 2 days, and she was short. Again, the bell above the door jingled, and a blast of cold air swept in. Sarah glanced up. A man stood in the doorway, shaking rain from his shoulders. His coat was too big for him, the fabric worn thin at the elbows. His shoes were cracked, the laces mismatched. His beard was patchy, his skin weathered. He looked around the diner, his eyes slow and searching, like he wasn't sure he was allowed to be there. Evening, Sarah called, forcing a smile. He nodded once and shuffled to the counter, sitting 2 stools from the end. He kept his head low. What can I get you? She asked, setting down a menu. He glanced at it, then shook his head. Don't have much money. Just maybe a coffee, if that's all right. His voice was low, rough from disuse. Sarah hesitated. She knew the owner didn't like giving things away. But something about the man's voice made her pause. There was no whining in it, no begging, just quiet resignation. Coffee's on the house, she said before she could stop herself. You want it black? His eyes flickered to hers for the first time. Yes, thank you. She poured him a steaming mug and slid it across. He wrapped his hands around it like it was the only warm thing he'd touched all day. Minutes passed. Outside, the rain got heavier. The only sounds inside were the hum of the fridge and the faint hiss of the grill. Sarah leaned on the counter. Rough night to be out. Rough year, he said, a ghost of a smile on his lips. Before she could ask more, the front door opened again. This time, it was a man in a business suit. Phone pressed his ear. He ordered a cheeseburger without looking up from his call, tapped his fingers impatiently while waiting, then left in a rush as soon as it was wrapped. The contrast between the 2 men lingered in Sarah's mind. By 12:30, the diner was empty except for her and the man at the counter. She was about to wipe down the booths when she noticed the pie case. Only 1 slice of apple pie remained. The smell of cinnamon drifted faintly from it. Her stomach growled. She'd skipped dinner, saving her last few dollars for bus fare tomorrow. She stared at the pie. She could take it home, warm it up, make her night a little easier. But then she glanced at the man, still cradling his coffee, staring into the dark liquid like it held answers. Without thinking too hard, she opened the case, set the slice on a plate, and placed it in front of him. What's this? He asked, frowning. Pie, she said simply. It's the last piece. Figured you could use it more than me. His hand hovered over the fork. You sure? Yeah, she said, turning away quickly so he wouldn't see the small knot of hunger in her own gut. He took a bite. For a moment, his eyes closed and a strange expression crossed his face. Not just pleasure, but something deeper, almost like memory. You didn't have to do this, he said quietly. I know. The rain slowed outside. The man finished the pie in small, careful bites, as though each one mattered. When he was done, he set the fork down gently, as if afraid it might break. Thank you, Sarah, he said. Her head snapped up. I never told you my name. He smiled faintly. It's on your name tag. She laughed at herself, shaking her head. But as she cleared the plate, she noticed he was watching her, not in a way that made her uncomfortable, but with a kind of steady interest, as though she'd just done something he wouldn't forget. By the time she brought the check, just for the coffee, he was already reaching into his pocket. He placed a crumpled dollar bill. and a handful of coins on the counter. "It's all I've got," he said. She tried to slide the money back, but he pushed it toward her. "I pay my debts." When he stood, she noticed he was taller than she thought. He pulled on his coat, buttoned it slowly, then gave her one last look. "Good night, Sarah." And then he stepped out into the night. She watched through the window as he walked away, disappearing into the rain-slicked streets. Sarah didn't know why, but she kept thinking about the way he'd said her name. The rain had finally stopped by the time Sarah locked up the diner. The streets were slick and gleaming under the yellow glow of the streetlights. She pulled her thin coat tighter around her shoulders and started the long walk to her apartment. The buses had stopped running, and a taxi was out of question. As she passed the alley beside the diner, a gust of damp air hit her face. She glanced down the narrow space, empty except for puddles and the hum of a flickering light. She thought of the man, how slowly he'd eaten the pie, how his voice had carried weight even when saying little. She wondered where he'd gone, if he had a place to sleep that night. Sarah shook the thought away. She had her own problems to solve. Her rent was due in 2 days, and she was still $78 short. The landlord, Mr. Horace, was not a patient man. He had already given her a warning last month. Another delay would mean eviction. By the time she reached her apartment building, her feet were sore. The building's front door stuck again. She had to shoulder it open. Inside, the smell of boiled cabbage from someone's dinner hung in the air. Her unit was on the 3rd floor, and every step up the narrow staircase made her calves burn. The apartment was small, a single room with a tiny kitchen, and a bathroom barely big enough to stand in. She set her bag down, kicked off her shoes, and sank into the worn armchair, the silence pressing on her. She thought about making tea, but decided against it. Her supply of groceries was running dangerously low, and she needed to stretch them until her next paycheck. Just before she turned out the light, she glanced at the corner of the table where her tips lay in a small pile. The coins from the man's coffee sat on top. For some reason, she didn't mix them in with the rest. The next day at the diner was busier. The breakfast rush came in waves, and Sarah moved quickly between tables, balancing plates and refilling coffee cups. She didn't have time to think about the man from last night until she noticed him again. He was outside, across the street, leaning against the brick wall of a closed shop. His coat was buttoned up, and his hands were shoved deep in the pockets. He wasn't looking at her, just at the street, but something told her he was aware of her. By the time she brought food to her last table and turned back toward the window, he was gone. The day went on. Lunch, another rush. A teenager spilled a milkshake on the floor. A couple argued loudly in a corner booth, and a delivery truck blocked the front door for 15 minutes. Sarah barely had a second to breathe. It wasn't until after the dinner crowd left that she saw him again. This time he came inside. The bell above the door jingled, and there he was, wet hair, damp coat, but the same steady eyes. "Back again," she said, trying to sound casual. "Yes, I am." She poured him a coffee without asking. "Any pie tonight?" he asked, glancing toward the display case. She shook her head. "Sold out hours ago." He nodded, as if that was the answer he expected. They didn't talk much. He drank his coffee in silence, but every now and then she caught him watching the diner, like he was studying it. The way Dave shouted orders, the regulars at the corner booth, the way Sarah moved from one task to the next without stopping. When he finished, he slid a $1 bill across the counter. This one was crisp, almost new. "That's more than the coffee," she said. "Consider it a thank you for yesterday." Before she could say more, he stood and left. That night, as she walked home, she had the uneasy sense that someone was following her. Every time she glanced over her shoulder, the street looked empty, just pools of light and shadow. Still, her pace quickened. At the corner near her building, she heard footsteps behind her. She turned sharply. A man in a hooded sweatshirt was closing the distance fast. "Hey," he called. "You dropped something." Her heart jumped into her throat. She didn't remember dropping anything. She backed up a step. "I'm fine," she said quickly. He stopped, hands raised. "Suit yourself." He tossed something to the ground near her, a folded slip of paper, and walked away. Sarah stood frozen until he disappeared into the night. Then, cautiously, she bent to pick it up. The paper was damp from the street, but inside was a $10 bill. There was no note. Inside her apartment, she locked the door and sat on the bed, staring at the bill. Who would give her money like this? The man in the diner? But why? And if it was him, why not hand it to her directly? The next day was colder. She wore an extra sweater under her uniform and still felt a draft each time the diner door opened. By mid-morning, she was wiping down the counter when she saw him again. Same coat, same watchful eyes. This time, he asked for toast with his coffee. "You get paid today?" she teased. He smiled faintly but didn't answer. Halfway through his meal, a group of 3 young men came in. They were loud from the start, shoving each other, swearing under their breath. Sarah's stomach tightened. They were the kind who thought a small diner was their playground. They ordered, then made a game of dropping utensils on the floor. so she'd have to pick them up. When she didn't react, one of them reached out and tugged the tie from her hair as she passed. The man at the counter set down his cup. "Knock it off," he said, his voice even but sharp enough to cut through the noise. The three men laughed. "What are you, her dad?" He didn't answer. He just stood up slowly, and for a second, Sarah saw something change in him, his posture, his eyes. The air around him shifted. The leader of the group hesitated. "Whatever, man. We're leaving." They tossed a couple of bills on the table and filed out. When Sarah turned to thank him, he was already sitting again, sipping his coffee like nothing had happened. "You didn't have to do that," she said quietly. "Yes, I did," he replied. For the rest of her shift, she couldn't shake the thought, who was this man? 2 days later, the air over the city was sharper, the kind that made your breath come out in thin clouds. The morning rush had been relentless at Grayson's diner, and Sarah hadn't had a moment to sit down. She balanced a tray of pancakes, bacon, and scrambled eggs in one hand, weaving between tables like a dancer avoiding collisions. It wasn't until she reached the counter that she noticed him again, the man in the worn coat. This time, he wasn't alone. He sat 2 stools away from a heavy-set guy in his 50s, with slick-back head of gray hair. The two weren't speaking, but Sarah caught the way the gray-haired man kept glancing sideways at him, as if checking he was still there. She poured coffee for them both. "Morning," she said lightly. The man in the coat nodded. The gray-haired one just grunted. His fingers tapped on the counter like he was keeping time to music only he could hear. When she returned a few minutes later, the gray-haired man had left. The seat was empty, and the man in the coat was stirring his coffee slowly, his expression unreadable. "Friend of yours?" Sarah asked. "No," he said after a pause. "Not really." Something in his tone made her drop the subject. The day went on, but that moment stuck in her mind. Later, during a lull in the afternoon, she stepped outside to get some air. The street was quiet except for a delivery truck down the block. She was leaning against the wall when she saw the gray-haired man again. He was across the street, talking to someone in a dark sedan. When he spotted her, he stopped mid-sentence and got into the car. The sedan pulled away. Sarah went back inside with a tight knot in her stomach. That evening, after the dinner crowd had thinned, the man in the coat came in again. He chose his usual seat at the counter. "You okay?" she asked as she poured his coffee. "I've been worse," he said with a faint smile. She hesitated. "That man you were with earlier, he was watching you." The man's eyes lifted to hers. "Yeah, I noticed." "Why?" Instead of answering, he took a sip of coffee. "Sometimes people watch because they're curious. Sometimes it's for other reasons." "You think he's trouble?" He gave a small shrug. "Trouble has a way of finding me." The way he said it wasn't boastful. It was matter of fact, like someone stating the weather. Before Sarah could press further, a loud crash came from the back of the diner. Dave, the cook, cursed in the kitchen. A stack of plates had slipped from a shelf, shattering across the floor. Sarah hurried to help, grateful for the distraction. When she returned, the man was gone. There was no money on the counter this time. Instead, there was a folded napkin. Inside was a single line of handwriting. "Don't walk home alone tonight." Her hands tightened around the napkin. By the time she closed up, the streets were darker than usual. One of the street lights near the corner had burned out, leaving the block in shadow. She considered calling a taxi, but dismissed the thought. She had just enough cash left for groceries tomorrow. Halfway home, she heard it again, footsteps behind her, slow, measured, matching her pace. She glanced over her shoulder. A figure in a hooded jacket was about 20 feet back, too far to make out a face. She crossed the street. So did they. Her heart began to race. She quickened her pace, tried to act casual. She knew the worst thing she could do was panic, but every step made the space between her shoulder blades itch. Ahead, the glow of a corner store sign spilled into the street. She darted inside, the bell above the door jangling. The man behind the counter gave her a brief nod as she pretended to browse the snack aisle. When she looked back outside, the figure was gone. She waited a full 5 minutes before stepping out again. The rest of the walk was quiet, but her nerves were still buzzing when she reached her apartment. That night, she locked the door and double-checked the windows. The next morning, she was pouring the first round of coffees for the early customers when he walked in. The man in the coat. "You didn't walk home alone, did you?" he asked without greeting. "I did," she admitted. "Why?" His jaw tightened. "Because someone was following you last night." Her stomach dropped. "That was you?" He shook his head. "No, I was too far away. But I saw him. Same guy from the other night with the sweatshirt." Sarah's fingers tightened around the coffee pot. "Do you know him?" "I know of him," he said slowly. "And you should stay in well-lit places after your shift. For now." He didn't explain further, and she didn't push, though 100 questions were buzzing in her head. Later that day, as she was clearing plates from a booth, the bell above the door rang again. This time it was the gray-haired man. He scanned the diner until his eyes landed on her. He took a seat at the counter, but not in the man's usual spot, 2 seats down. "Coffee," he said flatly. As she poured it, she noticed a gold ring on his finger. The stone in the center was large enough to catch the light with every movement of his hand. "You're Sarah, right?" he asked without looking up. Her pulse jumped. "Yeah, you've been talking to someone." Wears an old coat, sits at the counter. She froze for a second before answering. "I talk to a lot of customers." He smiled without warmth. "Be careful who you trust." Before she could respond, the man in the coat walked in. His eyes locked on the gray-haired man instantly. Neither said a word, but the air between them tightened like a stretched rope. The gray-haired man finished his coffee in 3 slow sips, left a $5 bill on the counter, and walked out. The man in the coat sat down in his usual spot. "What did he say to you?" Sarah hesitated. "That I should be careful who I trust." He gave a short, humorless laugh. "Good advice. Too bad it's coming from him." The next morning, Sarah woke before her alarm. She lay in bed staring at the ceiling, the voices from the day before replaying in her head. Be careful who you trust. She made a cup of weak instant coffee and tried to push the thought aside, but the words stuck to her like the dampness in the air. By the time she left the diner, the sun had barely risen, and the streets were washed in a pale, gray light. The breakfast crowd was already forming when she got there. The smell of bacon and coffee filled the small space. She slipped into her routine, taking orders, filling mugs, balancing trays, but her eyes kept flicking to the door. He came in around 9. The man in the coat. He walked in like he belonged there, like the place was an old habit. He sat in his usual seat and gave her a small nod. "Busy morning," he said. "Always," she replied, sliding him a cup of coffee. "You planning to tell me what's going on?" He stirred sugar into the cup, but didn't answer right away. "Let's just say you've been noticed. That's not always a good thing." Sarah frowned. "Noticed by who?" "That man yesterday. He's not just some random customer. He's involved in things you don't want to be involved in." Before she could ask more, a group of construction workers came in, their voices loud and cheerful. She moved quickly between their table and the counter, but every time she glanced back, the man was still there, drinking his coffee slowly, eyes scanning the diner like he was keeping watch. Around 11, the gray-haired man returned. The moment he stepped in, the atmosphere changed. His gaze swept over the diner, pausing briefly on Sarah before locking onto the man in the coat. "You again," he said, his voice calm but edged with something sharper. The man in the coat didn't move. "Looks that way." They stared at each other for a long moment, the chatter of the diner fading into a tense silence. "Mind if I have a word?" the gray-haired man asked. "Not interested," the man in the coat replied. The gray-haired man smirked. "Didn't think you'd be." He turned to Sarah. "Stay away from him." Then he walked out, leaving the door to swing shut behind him. Sarah let out a breath she didn't realize she'd been holding. What was that about? The man in the coat set his mug down. History. Leave it there. The rest of the day passed in a blur. But as she was closing up that night, she noticed something odd. On the counter, where the man had been sitting earlier, there was a folded piece of paper. Inside, written in neat block letters, were 3 words. "Don't go home." Her hands went cold. She looked out the diner window. The street was quiet, but the shadows seemed thicker than usual. She waited an extra hour before locking up, hoping the streets would be empty by the time she left. Still, she couldn't shake the feeling of eyes on her. Halfway down the block, she heard it, a soft scrape of shoes on pavement. She turned, but the sidewalk behind her was empty. She quickened her pace. When she reached her building, the front door was propped open. That never happened. She hesitated before stepping inside. The hallway was dark except for a single bulb flickering at the far end. Her apartment door was closed, just as she'd left it, but her fingers trembled as she slid the key into the lock. Inside, everything looked normal. She checked the windows, locked. The bathroom, empty. Still, she slept with a chair wedged under the doorknob that night. The next day, she told herself she was being paranoid. Maybe the note was just in being overprotective. Maybe the open door was just a neighbor forgetting to close it. The diner was quiet that afternoon. Only 2 tables were occupied when a man in a navy windbreaker came in. He didn't order anything, just walked up to the counter and set down an envelope. "This is for you," he said. His voice was low, almost like he didn't want anyone to hear. "What is it?" Sarah asked. He shrugged, didn't open it. Then he left, moving fast. Sarah stared at the envelope. It was plain white, her name printed neatly on the front. Inside were 20 $50 bills. Her breath caught. That was $1,000. More than enough to cover her rent, her bills, and still have some left over. But there was no note, no signature, nothing to say who had sent it. The man in the coat came in less than an hour later. She showed him the envelope. "Was this you?" she asked. He shook his head slowly. "No, and I'd be careful about using that money." Her stomach twisted. "Why?" "Because money like that always comes with strings. Before she could reply, the diner door opened again. The gray-haired man walked in, and his eyes went straight to the envelope on the counter. "Looks like you've had a good day," he said. Sarah slid the envelope out of sight. "You know anything about this?" He smiled faintly. Maybe I just know where it came from." "And," she pressed, "and you better decide fast whose side you're on." He tipped his head toward the man in the coat. "Because if you're with him, you're against me." The two men stared at each other again, the same silent battle hanging in the air. This time, Sarah felt like she was standing in the middle of something far bigger than herself. The diner felt smaller that afternoon, like the walls had inched closer. Sarah kept moving between tables, refilling coffee, wiping counters, trying to pretend everything was normal. But her eyes kept flicking to the two men. The man in the coat was sitting in his usual spot, his elbows resting lightly on the counter. The gray-haired man had taken a booth near the door, sipping his coffee slowly, his eyes never leaving the other man. The tension between them was almost visible, like a wire stretched tight across the diner. Sarah moved carefully, her footsteps quieter than usual, not wanting to draw attention from either side. Finally, the gray-haired man stood. He walked to the counter, placed a $20 bill next to his empty cup, and leaned slightly toward Sarah. "Don't forget what I said," he murmured. Then he walked out, the bell over the door jingling behind him. The man in the coat watched him leave, his jaw tight. "You should probably stay somewhere else tonight," he said quietly to Sarah. She frowned. "Why?" "Because of him." "Because I don't trust what he might do next," the man replied. "And you shouldn't either." Sarah didn't answer. She had never been the type to run just because someone told her to, but the weight of his tone stayed with her for the rest of her shift. When closing time came, she hesitated before locking the door. The street outside looked normal, streetlights glowing, cars passing, but she still felt that heavy sense of being watched. She decided to take a different route home, winding through side streets instead of the main road. It was quieter, almost too quiet. Her footsteps echoed against the brick walls. Halfway down an alley, a voice called out, "Sarah." She spun around. The man in the coat was there, stepping out from the shadows. "You shouldn't be walking here alone," he said. She tried to steady her voice. "Are you following me?" "Making sure you get home," he replied. They walked together the rest of the way, neither saying much. At her building, he stopped. "Lock your door. Double-check it. And if anything seems off, leave immediately." She wanted to ask why, but something in his expression told her she wouldn't get an answer. That night, she sat on her bed staring at the envelope of money. It was still on her table, untouched. She thought about her overdue rent, about the groceries she couldn't afford, about the endless stack of bills. The money could fix all of that, but his warning kept replaying in her head. Money like that always comes with strings. The next morning, she decided to keep it hidden, for now. At the diner, the first few hours were uneventful. Then, just before the lunch rush, a black sedan pulled up outside. The gray-haired man stepped out, but he wasn't alone. Another man got out from the passenger side, a tall man in a dark suit, clean-shaven, with sharp eyes. They both entered, and Sarah felt the room tighten. "Coffee," the gray-haired man said as they took a booth. She brought it over, trying to ignore the way the suited man's gaze lingered on her. "You're Sarah," he said, as if confirming something. "Yes," she replied cautiously. He smiled slightly. "I hear you're a helpful person." She didn't answer, just set the coffee down and walked away. From behind the counter, she could feel their eyes on her. The man in the coat walked in a few minutes later, and the moment he saw them, his expression hardened. The suited man glanced up, then leaned across the booth to the gray-haired man. Whatever he said made the older man smirk. The man in the coat took his usual seat at the counter, his back to them. "Don't react to anything they say," he murmured to Sarah when she passed. But keeping calm was harder than she expected. After a few minutes, the suited man called her over. "Miss, do you have a moment?" She hesitated, then walked to their booth. "Have you decided what to do with the money?" he asked casually, like he was asking about the weather. Her heart thudded. "I don't know what you're talking about." He chuckled. "Sure you do." The gray-haired man added, "It's simple. Keep it and you're in. Give it back and you're out. But either way, we don't like loose ends." Sarah's hands clenched around her order pad. "I think you should leave," she said quietly. The suited man leaned back, still smiling. "We'll see you around." They left a few minutes later, their coffee untouched. When the door closed behind them, the man in the coat turned to her. "Don't be alone tonight." "I mean it." She was about to argue when Dave came out of the kitchen, grumbling about an order. The moment was broken. That evening, Sarah asked her co-worker Mia if she could crash on her couch for the night. Mia agreed without question. But as Sarah left the diner, she noticed the same black sedan parked across the street. She tried not to look, but out of the corner of her eye, she saw the suited man in the passenger seat, watching her. She took the long way to Mia's apartment, weaving through crowded streets, changing direction twice. Still, when they reached the building, She caught a glimpse of the sedan turning the corner at the far end of the block. Inside, Mia handed her a blanket and pointed to the couch. "You okay? You look like you've seen a ghost." Sarah forced a small smile. "I'm fine, just tired." But she didn't sleep much that night. Every car that passed outside made her tense. Every creak of the building sounded too loud. The next morning, she left early, hoping to avoid anyone waiting for her. But when she rounded the corner near the diner, the man in the coat was already there, leaning against the wall. "They're not going to stop," he said quietly. "Not until they get what they want." "And what do they want?" she asked. He looked at her for a long moment before answering. "You." Sarah stood frozen, staring at him. "Me?" she asked, her voice low. The man in the coat nodded. "Not because of who you are right now, but because of something you've done." Her mind raced. "The pie?" she asked, almost laughing at the absurdity. Maybe not," he said. "All I know is they put you on their radar. And once you're there, they don't forget." Before she could respond, the morning rush began pouring in, regulars, delivery drivers, a couple of tourists with cameras around their necks. Sarah forced herself into work mode, but she kept glancing toward the window, half expecting to see the black sedan parked outside again. Around 10, it appeared. It didn't park directly across from the diner this time, just far enough down the street to be less obvious. But Sarah knew. The suited man was in the passenger seat again, sunglasses hiding his eyes. The man in the coat noticed too. He drained his coffee, set a few bills on the counter, and stood. "I'll be back," he said. She didn't see him again for the rest of the shift. At closing time, Sarah stepped outside cautiously, scanning the street. The sedan was gone. She let out a slow breath and started walking. She was halfway to her building when a voice came from an alley to her right. "Sarah." She froze. The suited man stepped out of the shadows, hands in his coat pockets. "Relax," he said. "I'm not here to hurt you. Just want to talk." Her instincts screamed at her to run, but her legs wouldn't move. "About the money," he continued. It was a gesture, a show of goodwill, but ignoring it. "That's not good for either of us." "I didn't ask for it," she said, trying to keep her voice steady. "No," he agreed. "But you took it. That means something." "I haven't spent it." "That doesn't matter." He stepped closer, his shoes crunching on gravel. "You're involved now. You can't uninvolve yourself." She took a step back. "I think this conversation's over." Before he could answer, footsteps echoed from the other end of the alley. The man in the coat appeared, moving quickly. "That's enough," he said. The suited man's smile didn't fade. "Always in the way, aren't you?" "Walk away," the man in the coat replied, his tone calm but unshakable. After a tense moment, the suited man shrugged. "For now." He turned and disappeared into the street. The man in the coat looked at Sarah. "You okay?" She nodded, though her pulse was still racing. "Who are they?" He hesitated. "People you don't want to owe. And right now they think you do." The next day, Sarah tried to act normal. She worked her shift, serve her customers, and smile when she had to. But the truth was, every time the door opened, she felt her chest tighten. By mid-afternoon, it happened again. The gray-haired man walked in, but this time he didn't sit down. He just stood near the counter. "Sarah," he said, "come outside for a moment." "I'm working," she replied quickly. "This is important." Before she could refuse again, the man in the coat came through the door. He stepped between her and the gray-haired man. "She's not going anywhere with you," he said. The gray-haired man's expression stayed calm. "You can't protect her forever." "Watch me," the man in the coat replied. The gray-haired man gave a short nod, as if the exchange had told him something he wanted to know. Then he left, not looking back. Sarah's knees felt weak. "This is getting worse," she whispered. "It will," the man in the coat said, "unless you make a choice." That night, she decided to do something she'd never done before. Follow him. When he left the diner after closing, she waited a minute, then slipped out the door and kept her distance. He walked with a steady pace, turning down streets she rarely used. Finally, he entered a small, dimly lit bar on the edge of the neighborhood. She hesitated at the doorway before stepping inside. The place smelled of stale beer and cigarette smoke. A jukebox played quietly in the corner. She spotted him in a booth near the back, speaking in low tones to a man she didn't recognize, a lean guy with sharp cheekbones and a scar running from his ear to his jaw. She tried to stay out of sight, but the lean man's eyes caught hers. He tilted his head toward the man in the coat. "You're being followed," he said to him. The man in the coat turned sharply. When he saw her, his expression shifted from surprise to something closer to frustration. "What are you doing here?" he asked. "I needed answers," she said. "This isn't the place for them," he replied firmly. "Go home. Now." Before she could argue, the door to the bar opened and two men stepped in. One of them was a suited man. The other was a stranger, broad-shouldered, his eyes cold. The man in the coat stood immediately. "We're leaving," he told her. The suited man blocked the doorway. Going somewhere? The lean man with the scar moved first, stepping between them. You heard him. They're leaving. For a moment, it felt like the whole room was holding its breath. Then the suited man smiled. Enjoy your night, he said, stepping aside. Outside, the air felt heavier. Sarah walked quickly beside the man in the coat. You need to stop following me, he said quietly. Not until you tell me what's happening. He glanced at her, his jaw tightening. Fine. Tomorrow, after your shift. Somewhere quiet. She didn't sleep much that night, but for the first time, she felt like she might finally get the truth. The next morning, Sarah's hands wouldn't stop shaking. She poured coffee for the first customer of the day and nearly spilled it. She kept glancing at the clock. Her shift felt longer than usual, every tick stretching like an elastic band ready to snap. The man in the coat didn't come in for breakfast. He didn't come for lunch either. By 3 p.m., Sarah was fighting the urge to believe he'd changed his mind. At 4:15, the bell above the diner door jingled. He walked in, calm as ever, his eyes sweeping the room before landing on her. Ready? He asked. Sarah nodded, quickly wiping her hands on her apron. She told Marie she had to leave early. Marie gave her a look, but didn't ask questions. Outside, the man in the coat led her down a side street, away from the main road. His stride was purposeful, his head turning every so often to check behind them. Where are we going? She asked. Someplace no one will bother us, he said. They ended up at a small park on the edge of the neighborhood, the kind with worn benches and a cracked basketball court. A few kids played nearby, their shouts echoing in the cool air. They sat on a bench under a half-dead tree. You want answers, he began. So listen carefully. No interruptions. Sarah folded her arms but stayed quiet. The men you've seen, the one in the sedan, the gray-haired man, the others, they're part of something bigger than you think. They control money, business deals, even some city officials. The kind of people who get what they want without asking twice. And what do they want from me? Not you. Not really. But you got their attention when you gave that pie to the man on the sidewalk. They noticed him. Then they noticed you. Why? She asked, unable to help herself. He paused. Because the man you fed wasn't just any homeless man. Before she could press for more, his gaze shifted sharply to the left. A dark SUV had just pulled up to the curb. Stay here, he told her, standing. Two men stepped out of the SUV. They weren't the same ones she'd seen before, but their suits, their posture, their cold eyes, it was the same kind of presence. One of them spoke, his voice deep and steady. We need to have a word with the lady. She's not available. The man in the coat replied. This isn't a request, the other man said. Sarah's heart was pounding. The kids on the basketball court had stopped playing, watching from a distance. The first man stepped closer. Come with us. Now. I'm not going anywhere, Sarah said, though her voice wavered. The man in the coat moved slightly in front of her. Then I guess we're done here, he said to them. The men didn't leave. Instead, one of them opened his jacket just enough to reveal the outline of something metallic inside. A gun, maybe. Last chance, he said. Everything after that happened fast. The man in the coat stepped forward, grabbed the man's wrist, and twisted. The metallic object clattered to the ground. It was a gun. The second man lunged, but Sarah instinctively kicked at his shin. The man in the coat shoved the first attacker into the second, sending both stumbling backward. Run, he shouted. Sarah didn't hesitate. She sprinted toward the street, her lungs burning. The man in the coat was right behind her. They didn't stop until they were several blocks away. They ended up in a narrow alley, both gasping for breath. You okay? He asked. She nodded, though she wasn't sure she meant it. They were going to take me. They still might try, he said grimly, which is why we can't stay out in the open anymore. They ducked into a corner store, blending in with a couple of customers browsing the aisles. Sarah grabbed a bottle of water, trying to steady her hands as she opened it. You need to tell me who that homeless man really is, she said. The man in the coat looked at her for a long moment, as if weighing the risk. I can't tell you everything yet, but I'll say this, he's not who you think. And the people after you? They think you know more than you do. That's insane. I barely spoke to him. That doesn't matter. In their world, appearances are everything. You're already a piece on their board. They left the store and kept walking, avoiding main roads. By the time they reached a quieter area, the sun was dipping low, the sky a pale orange. They stopped outside a rundown building with boarded-up windows. The man in the coat pushed open the door, revealing a dim interior that smelled faintly of dust and oil. This place isn't much, but no one will find us here tonight, he said. Sarah looked around. The space was empty except for a few crates and an old desk in a corner. Why are you helping me? She asked quietly. He didn't answer right away. Instead, he pulled out a small worn notebook and began flipping through it. Finally, he said, because once someone helped me, and I didn't deserve it either. They ate dinner from a couple of paper bags he'd picked up on the way, cold sandwiches and chips. The silence between them wasn't uncomfortable, but it was heavy with unspoken questions. At one point, she caught him glancing out the boarded-up window, his hand resting near his jacket pocket. "You think they'll come tonight?" she asked. "Always plan for it," he replied. Sarah didn't sleep much. The creaks of the building and distant sirens kept her on edge. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the SUV, the men in suits, the flash of metal. When dawn finally came, the man in the coat was already up, peering through a small gap in the boards. "They're still looking," he said. "We need to move before they close in." They left the boarded-up building before the streets were fully awake. Sarah's legs felt stiff on the cold floor, but she pushed herself to keep pace with the man in the coat. The city looked different in the early morning. Fewer people, quieter streets, the hum of delivery trucks replacing the usual rush of cars. But every time a black vehicle turned a corner, Sarah's chest tightened. "Where are we going now?" she asked, pulling her coat tighter. "A place where we can watch without being watched," he said. They zigzagged through side streets, passing closed shops with metal shutters and trash bins lined along the curbs. Sarah noticed he never walked in a straight line for long, always turning, always checking reflections in windows. After nearly 20 minutes, they reached an old laundromat. The sign above the door was faded, and the glass was streaked with dust. The man in the coat unlocked it with a small key, and the bell above the door gave a tired jingle. Inside, the air smelled faintly of detergent and metal. Most of the machines were unplugged, and the ones that weren't had out-of-order signs taped to them. He led her to a back room where a small desk sat beneath a single bare bulb. On the wall was a corkboard covered in photos, scraps of paper, and a map with pins stuck in various places. Sarah froze. She recognized one of the photos. It was of her outside the diner, carrying a tray of coffee. "You've been watching me," she said slowly. "I've been watching them," he corrected, pointing to a cluster of photos that showed the suited men in their cars and what looked like a warehouse on the outskirts of town. "You just ended up in their path." Sarah's eyes darted to a photo of the homeless man she'd given the pie to. His head was lowered, his clothes ragged, but his posture, straight back, squared shoulders, looked out of place for someone living on the street. "Who is he?" she asked. The man in the coat didn't answer right away. Instead, he took a deep breath. "Let's just say he's someone these men want to disappear. And by giving him that pie, you got their attention." Before Sarah could reply, the sound of car doors slamming outside cut through the quiet. The man in the coat moved to the window and lifted the corner of the curtain. His jaw tightened. "They found us." Sarah's pulse shot up. "What do we do?" He grabbed a black duffel bag from under the desk and unzipped it, revealing a few folded clothes, bottled water, a flashlight, and what looked like rolled-up blueprints. "We don't fight them here," he said. "We move." They slipped out the back door into a narrow alley, the cold air biting Sarah's cheeks. Voices echoed faintly from front of the laundromat, deep, sharp, impatient. They jogged down the alley, turning sharply into a street lined with dumpsters. The man in the coat stopped at one and lifted the lid. Inside, beneath a layer of flattened cardboard boxes, was a black motorcycle. Sarah stared. "You've been hiding a motorcycle in a dumpster?" "Best place to keep it from them," he said, pulling it out. Within moments, they were speeding through the city. The wind whipped Sarah's hair into her face, and she clung to him, her heart pounding with every turn. They wove through traffic, then out toward the industrial district, where the roads grew wider and emptier. Finally, they pulled into a shadowy corner behind a row of shipping containers. The air smelled of rust and seawater. "This buys us a few hours," he said, cutting the engine. "But they'll keep looking." Sarah slid off the bike, her legs trembling. "You still haven't told me why you care so much about this." The man in the coat leaned against the bike, watching her. "Because I owe him the man you fed. I owe him more than I can ever repay. And I won't let them take him." Sarah's stomach twisted. She wanted to ask how, why, when, but footsteps interrupted her thoughts. They weren't alone. From between two containers, a figure appeared. It wasn't one of the men in suits. This man wore a dark beanie and a leather jacket, his eyes scanning the area before settling on the man in the coat. "You're late," the newcomer said. "Change of plans," the man in the coat replied. The newcomer's gaze flicked to Sarah. "She's the one? She's with me?" The man in the coat said firmly. The newcomer hesitated, then jerked his head toward a warehouse a block away. "We have to move. They're sweeping the docks." Inside the warehouse, the air was cooler, filled with a faint hum of machinery. Crates were stacked high, some marked with faded shipping labels. The newcomer led them to a corner where a table was covered in papers, and a small radio crackled with static. "They're closing in," the newcomer said, pointing to a rough map of the dock area. "We got maybe half an hour before they reach this side." Sarah leaned over the map. "And then what? What happens if they find us?" "They won't," the man in the coat said, but she noticed his grip tightening on the edge of the table. The newcomer moved to a crate and pulled out two small duffel bags. Take these. Everything you need to get out of the city. Sarah's chest tightened. Get out of the city? I work at a diner. I have a life here. That life's gone, the man in the coat said. At least until this ends. The thought of leaving everything behind hit her like a punch, but the urgency in their voices made it clear this wasn't up for debate. They stayed in the warehouse for another 20 minutes, listening to the static-filled radio. At one point, a voice came through, speaking in clipped, urgent sentences. The newcomer's expression darkened. They're closer than we thought, he said. We move now. They slipped out a side door into the dim light, the man in the coat keeping Sarah close. Somewhere in the distance, the low growl of an engine echoed through the docks. Sarah didn't know where they were going next. She only knew that whatever this was, it wasn't over, not even close. The wind at the docks cut through Sarah's clothes as they hurried away from the warehouse. The sky was still a dull gray, heavy with the smell of the sea. Ships loomed in the distance, their masts swaying, chains clinking faintly. The man in the coat kept a firm hand on her arm, steering her toward a row of cargo trucks parked under dim floodlights. The newcomer walked ahead, glancing over his shoulder every few seconds. We're using the trucks? Sarah asked, her breath coming fast. Not exactly, the man in the coat replied. There's something behind them. When they reached the last truck, the newcomer crouched and pulled a tarp aside, revealing a narrow maintenance tunnel. The dark opening smelled of oil and damp concrete. Sarah hesitated. Where does it go? Out of here, the newcomer said. If we stay above ground, they'll trap us. They slipped into the tunnel, the sound of their footsteps echoing off the narrow walls. The air was heavy, and the dim light from the opening faded quickly as they moved deeper. The man in the coat flicked on a flashlight, the beam cutting a sharp path ahead. Behind them, faint voices began to rise, distant but getting closer. Sarah's pulse thudded in her ears. They're following, she whispered. Then we keep moving, the man in the coat said, his voice low but firm. The tunnel twisted and sloped downward before opening into a wide underground space. Pipes ran along the ceiling, dripping occasionally into puddles below. To the left, a rusted ladder led up to a heavy grate. This is our exit, the newcomer said, climbing quickly. He pushed at the grate, and with a loud creak, it lifted enough for him to slip through. Sarah followed, the cold metal biting into her hands. When she emerged, she found herself in a small, overgrown lot behind a chain-link fence. The smell of fuel hung in the air, and the distant rumble of traffic told her they were near a road. But before the man in the coat could climb out, shouts echoed from the tunnel below. A beam of light flashed against the wall. They're here, Sarah gasped. The man in the coat pushed her toward the fence. Go. Don't stop until you reach the road. Sarah hesitated. What about you? I'll be right behind you, he said, but his eyes didn't meet hers. She squeezed through a gap in the fence, her jacket snagging on the wire. She tore it free and stumbled into the tall grass. Behind her, she heard the scrape of boots on a ladder. The newcomer grabbed her hand and pulled her forward. Keep moving. They ran toward the road, their shoes crunching over gravel. A truck roared past, its headlights sweeping over them. Then a gunshot. Sarah froze, her breath catching. The sound had come from behind. She turned just in time to see the man in the coat emerge from the gap in the fence, clutching his side. His face was pale, but he kept moving. The suited men were only seconds behind him, their dark silhouettes closing in. Run, he shouted. They sprinted across the road as another shot rang out. Tires screeched somewhere to their left, and a black van swerved into view. The newcomer yanked open the side door. Get in. Sarah climbed in, the man in the coat right behind her. The van lurched forward before the door was even closed. Inside, the air was thick with exhaust fumes and tension. A woman in the driver's seat didn't take her eyes off the road. We've got one shot to lose them. Hold on. The van sped to the city's edge, weaving between cars and cutting down narrow side streets. Behind them, the black SUV stayed close, its headlights glaring in the mirrors. The woman turned sharply into a covered parking structure. Out, she ordered. Switch vehicles. They piled out of the van and into a dusty sedan parked in the shadows. Within seconds, they were on the move again, the SUV now searching the wrong direction. Finally, after what felt like hours, they pulled into a quiet residential street. The engines cooled, the night air settling heavy around them. The man in the coat leaned back, wincing, his hand still pressed to his side. Sarah wanted to say something, but the weight of everything, running, hiding, leaving her life behind, left her silent. The woman in the driver's seat spoke first. We'll keep moving. You're not safe yet, but tonight they lost. Sarah looked out the window. The street lamps flickered, the houses silent. Somewhere far away, the sea kept its slow, steady rhythm. For now they had escaped. But the look of the man in the coat's eyes told her one thing clearly. This wasn't the end. It was only the beginning of a longer fight. If you like this story, make sure to like, share, and subscribe. Also, an other to strengthen our community. Let us know in the comments where you are watching from and what time you are currently watching this video.